Okay, welcome everybody. So today we're hearing from Rogelio Luque Lora, or you can call him Roge, who is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. He's had a sort of varied career. He did his undergrad in natural sciences, a master's in the history and philosophy of science, and is now doing a PhD. I mean, you're in the geography department, but you're loosely in geography, looking at environmental values, and part of which he did in Chile, doing some field work there. And Roge is going to talk about what conservation is.
Right, hoping everyone can hear me online. Let us know if you can't. Thank you, Hannah, for introducing me, and thank you everyone for inviting me to talk. As Hannah knows, I've enjoyed writing this essay far too much, and it's a great pleasure to be presenting it here. And while I'm thanking people, thanks Chris Sandbrook, my supervisor, for always being the best. I should say this paper is currently probably under a second round of reviews at Conservation and Society, and the first round was super helpful. So thanks to anonymous people, and thanks to my funders as well. Right, so I appreciate this is a very big question. What is conservation? So first, and it's very bold of me, I appreciate to come here and try and define it. So first, say a little about the different definitions that there are around and why I felt that there was a need for a better articulation of what conservation is. And then I'll propose my own understanding with qualifiers and context. And then once I arrive at this proposed definition, I'll test it against two novel or recent proposals for new ways, or supposedly new ways of doing conservation, which are so-called new conservation and compassionate conservation. And I'll use my definition to ask the question of whether these new movements are truly conservation, because they've both faced the critique of not being conservation at all. And here's one way in which definitions matter. And I'll end with some conclusions. Right, so people, or many people, have felt for a while that traditional understandings of what conservation is are unhelpfully narrow. I don't know if anyone's read Bill Adams' Against Extinction, which is a history of the Western conservation movement. Bill is great. And he places one of the origins of Western conservation in British colonial Africa, and shows how these understandings of conservation revolved around hunting ethics and proper hunting, especially in like aristocratic circles. These very narrow understandings of what conserving was, which is basically to conserve the species that these rich men like to shoot, served to exclude other good ways of relating to the land, for instance, native hunting or settler agriculture. And then, as I see it, more relatively recent, but still in the last few decades, biological understandings of what conservation is have often also been quite narrow and have served to exclude other ways of doing conservation. So Michael Soulei's very well-read paper, for instance, what is conservation biology, entirely frames the question of what conservation is using very biological and ecological concepts such as species or evolutionary processes or ecological complexity. And again, in recent decades, these narrow or relatively narrow biological understandings of what conservation is have served to exclude, say, indigenous or to perhaps delegitimize several indigenous ways of doing conservation, for instance, or understandings of conservation that, while still Western, do not share the same assumptions as biologists do, say, for instance, those from political ecology or the critical social sciences. So I was by no means the first person to notice that many of these traditional understandings of conservation are unhelpfully narrow and sometimes exclusionary, and people have proposed broader understandings of what is conservation. A few years ago, Chris, my supervisor, in a short paper in Oryx, proposed to understand conservation as actions intended to establish, maintain, or improve good relations with nature. And you can see that it's unmistakable that Chris is trying to broaden out the scope of conservation to account for other good ways of relating to the natural world that are not perhaps the ones that biologists, or back in colonial times, aristocratic hunters would have thought of. But I felt that definitions like Chris's, and Chris has forgiven me multiple times for saying this, are too broad. They cast the net too wide, because they don't allow us to distinguish conservation from other good ways of relating to the natural world. Say, for instance, animal rights activism or concern for the welfare of domesticated animals. That is a good relation with nature, or can at least be argued to be a good relation with nature. But most of us, if not all of us as conservationists, would not really identify ourselves as conservationists with those pursuits. We might do in our personal lives, but not as conservationists. So I felt that what was needed is a halfway house, an understanding of conservation that would at least not so necessarily exclude other worthwhile approaches to what we might intuitively call conservation, but at the same time serve to distinguish conservation from other good ways of relating to the natural world, which we feel are not conservation, such as animal rights activism, for instance. Right. And before I propose my understanding of conservation, I need to qualify it. By no means am I attempting to settle once and for all what conservation is in a universal way. I was brought up in Europe, and embarrassingly, I've done all my studies and research at one university in the UK. So I have a very narrow slice, if you like, of exposure to what conservation is. And it's not just my understanding of conservation, but the very concepts that I use to articulate my argument. Things like the living world or the more than human world, the very idea of what it is to be human. Those concepts are grounded in particular knowledges and schools of thought. And if you go talk to people who don't belong in those Western traditions, for example, there are Amazonian cultures in which the understanding of what it is to be a person includes many non-human animals, but excludes some members of the species Homo sapiens. So I'm aware that the concepts that I deploy are culturally situated. And then finally, language itself is never neutral, right? I really like this quote by the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, who wrote, "Language, which always fails us when we wish to fully express ourselves as individuals, paradoxically lays bare, without us wanting it to, the deeper secrets of the society that speaks it." So I'm aware that just by uttering words in the English language, I'm conveying a set of ideologies and political assumptions. With all those disclosures in mind, what do I think conservation is? In my paper, I articulate my definition in 3 steps. And the first step is the recognition that things of value exist in the living world. So as ecologists, we might describe ecosystems, for instance, or model population trends, but it's not enough to know the natural world as it is from a descriptive point of view. To be a conservationist, one must find value in the natural world. Now, different conservationists have different priorities as to what is valuable in nature. Those interested in, say, the diversity of domesticated crops have typically focused on genetic diversity. Those interested in the conservation of wild species are interested in species. And yet other conservationists find most value in landscapes or ecological processes. And it's not just what things are deemed to be valuable by conservationists that differs between conservationists, but also what kinds of value are found in the natural world. So I'd wager that most conservationists think the natural world is intrinsically valuable. It's valuable beyond its contribution to human interests. But others, and especially recently with frameworks such as the Ecosystem Services Framework, have chosen to emphasize the instrumental value of nature. But regardless of the differences in what things are deemed to be valuable and what kind of value is found in the natural world, all conservationists, I think, share the recognition that value exists in the world beyond humankind. The second step in my articulation is the promotion of the continued existence of those valuable things. I've pored over these words for a very long time and have changed them in response to some of the comments from reviewers. But the words continued existence are there because I think most conservationists are not so much worried with temporary states or transient harm. What really concerns them is the possibility of permanent loss. And therefore, what they're seeking to promote is the continued existence of those valuable things. Initially, my definition did not use the word promotion. I framed it as protection from threats, which I think is probably the dominant understanding in Western conservation, hence the cornerstone nature of protected areas in Western approaches to conservation, but not all approaches to conservation are framed in terms of protecting valuable things from threats. Say, for instance, if we managed water levels for water bird population species, that's not so much protecting them from a threat, but rather adjusting the state of a habitat to promote the continued existence of those birds. And then finally, I think for conservation to be intelligible, it has to unfold in what I have called the extended human time. So that promotion of continued existence only makes sense in what for me are time spans longer than a single human generation, but still within the range where future generations of humans with whom we can identify exist. Why do I think this is the case? Well, in time spans shorter than extended human time, say the lifespans of most individual organisms, these are too short for their continued existence or the promotion of their continued existence to be a feasible project. So most individual animals and most individual plants are born and die too fast for it to be a meaningful project for humans to try and preserve them into the future. There are exceptions to that, of course, like this Bewin monkey puzzle tree in Hualmapu in Chile. They can live thousands of years. So perhaps in those exceptional contexts, it could make sense to conserve or try to conserve individual organisms. But generally, that's a futile pursuit. But that idea that ecological wholes can persist even though the individuals that form them come and go all the time is very nicely captured by Ishmael, the narrator of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. When he writes that we account the whale immortal in his species, Ishmael thought that whaling practices did not endanger whales. To be fair to him, harpoons were cast by hand at that time. However perishable whales are in their individuality. So the whale species can persist in the right kind of time. But then on the other end of the spectrum, if we consider time spans longer than extended human time, say geological time, we know from the fossil record that even ecological wholes such as species come and go all the time. So at these very vast and deep spans of time, even the conservation of these entities is a futile pursuit. There's a great quote from a paper that is 30 years old now, but I think it's really important to read old papers from Andrew Holland, I think, and Kate Rawls, who wrote, "We'll hold a picture of life in all its rich and varied forms continuing into the future. We may indeed know for a theoretical certainty that it must all come to an end someday, and we may even believe that in the context of eternity, life itself is a matter of indifference. But for most of us, such a realization serves only to make life itself more precious." I think this passage is very grounded in what I have called extended human time, because they are articulating their vision for conservation in this human understanding of what kinds of spans of time is it possible to consider the transitioning of the present into the future so as to secure the continued existence of these valuable things. So taking these three steps together, I have proposed to understand conservation as the promotion, or at least the intended promotion, of the continued existence of valuable things in the living world in extended human time. Right. Having arrived at that definition, I then use it to test whether new conservation or so-called new conservation and compassionate conservation are truly conservation. The first thing that needs to be said about new conservation is that it's not new at all. The ideas within the framework that Peter Carive and Michel Marvier proposed 10 years ago now have been around for decades, if not centuries. And there's a paper from 1999 entitled something along the lines of new conservation, and it's suggesting the same ideas, which is why I think it's important to read older papers. But basically, in their response to Michael Soulet's foundational paper, What is Conservation Biology, Carive and Marvier tried to broaden out the scope of conservation, hence a shift from biology to science. They also argue, not because they don't believe in the intrinsic nature of the intrinsic value of the non-human world, but they think appeals to intrinsic value have generally failed to resonate with the public and with policymakers. So they suggest that conservationists would do better to emphasize the instrumental value of nature instead. And within this vein, they think that partnering with capitalist enterprises and with corporations that advance human development is a good way of promoting the appeal of conservation beyond the world of conservationists. And then finally, perhaps the fourth major tenet that they propose is to abandon this ideal of pristine nature and wilderness and instead try to seek value in ecological novelty in anthropogenically dominated ecosystems. I'm going to focus on the fourth of these tenets in this talk. Some of the others have been flogged to death already and back and forth by a number of scholars. So I'll focus on the issue of ecological novelty. Writers such as Emma Maris and Fred Pearce have popularized this push to give up on the idea of pristine wilderness and try to, as they put it, learn to love non-native species, for instance, and embrace at times anthropogenic change. And of course, this has raised a lot of eyebrows in more traditional sectors of conservation. And there are more traditional conservationists who have even argued that new conservation is not conservation at all. So can the embrace of anthropogenic change and of ecological novelty be considered conservation? Well, using my definition, I think there are at least two ways in which it can. The first is to realize that for many of these writers, such as Maris or Pearce, the overarching goal of promoting the continued existence of species is not challenged at all. What they are proposing is new strategies that they think are more effective to protect these species. So they use a range of examples where, for instance, embracing non-native species has helped native species survive the threats that they face. So in those cases, the overarching goals of conservation are not being challenged, and I think new conservation is legitimately conservation. A second possibility is to think about the first step in my definition, which I explored with different things that people find valuable in the natural world, and consider that what some of these people find valuable are not fixed entities such as species, but rather processes and fluxes such as evolutionary diversification or nutrient cycling, for instance, and that for them, embracing these anthropogenic changes is a way of promoting the continued existence of these processes. Of course, we can challenge both of these contentions empirically, but at least in theory, I think this approach is compatible with my understanding of conservation. And then I imagine compassionate conservation is more familiar here because it's very heavily an Australian sort of proposition. But the starting premise for compassionate conservationists is that traditionally conservationists have often inflicted large amounts of intentional, often unnecessary harm on individual animals. We've all heard about, say, mice being poisoned to protect seabird species, or other animals being culled. And against this, these practices, compassionate conservationists propose a series of tenets, perhaps the most fundamental of which is the belief that the lives of individual animals matter in and of themselves beyond their importance as parts of broader ecological wholes. And just like new conservation, compassionate conservation has faced the critique that it's not conservation at all. It has also been, well, within the critique that it's not conservation at all, what critics have argued about is that compassionate conservationists are just animal rights activists disguising as conservationists. But also empirically, scholars have contended or challenged the propositions of compassionate conservation, arguing that, for instance, if we refrain from culling feral horses in Australia, which is one of the examples that compassionate conservationists gave as a change in practices, the horses themselves will continue to suffer, may even suffer more, because many of them will die of starvation or thirst, and also will put already threatened species at even higher risk. So can compassionate conservation be considered legitimately conservation? I think just like with new conservation, there are two ways, or at least two ways in which it can. The first one is to realize that many of the activities that are harmful to species and to ecosystems are harmful precisely because they harm individual animals. So if we think about the unsustainable harvest of wild animals, for instance, that's damaging both the individual animals that are harvested, but also puts the species to which they belong at greater threat. Often destructing habitats is not just bad for ecosystems, obviously, but also for the animals that live in them. And I think whenever summoning compassion toward individual animals can advance the more established conservation goals of protecting the kinds of things that I have argued can exist in extended human time, such as species and ecosystems, then compassionate conservation can be considered to be true conservation. And the second way to re-understand or re-apprehend compassionate conservation is to realize that many of the people within this movement do not challenge established conservation goals at all. So they've been at pains to clarify that they do think things such as species and ecosystems are intrinsically valuable in and of themselves, and they think it's a good thing that conservationists try and conserve them. All they are demanding is that those goals are pursued with compassion. And they say this entails, for instance, trying to minimize harm that is unnecessary, while appreciating that, yes, there are times when individual animals have to be harmed for the sake of conserving species, but that this should at least be minimized wherever possible, and that when it's inevitable, it should be done, say, with a heavy heart and an awareness of the damage that is being done. But as a final point, there have been people within compassionate conservation who've gone further and said that in cases where we face the choice between letting a species go extinct and inflicting large amounts of suffering to individual animals, the ethical choice is to let the species go extinct because individuals are more important than wholes. And I think in those cases, those views cannot be considered conservation because of my earlier point of the project of ensuring the continued existence of individual animals being futile because of the very fast turnover in their lives. Now, this is not to say that one should then damage or harm the animals and protect the species. It might still be that the right thing to do is to let the species go extinct. But importantly, that would have to be argued on grounds other than conservation, for instance, on the sentience and the ethical importance of sentient beings. And this is something, I think, or one case in which definitions matter. They help us get greater clarity of thought as to which good reasons we're bringing to bear on difficult ethical decisions. Are we doing certain things or refraining to do certain things as conservationists, or are we doing it out of other good ways of relating to the natural world that, although can't be considered legitimately conservation, are still worthwhile and even at times could be more important than conservation? Right, so to conclude then, I've argued that conservation can be understood as the promotion of the continued existence of valuable things in the living world in extended human time. And I've then used this definition to ask the question of whether so-called new conservation is conservation. And I've argued that in cases where embracing ecological novelty serves traditional conservation goals of conserving species, for instance, then it is legitimately conservation, and that it can also be understood as conservation if the shift in value if the emphasis in value shifts from fixed entities such as species to fluxes and processes such as evolutionary diversification. And then I brought my definition to bear on the question of whether compassionate conservation is conservation. And I argued that in cases where summoning compassion for individual animals advances traditional conservation goals, then it is conservation. And whenever those traditional goals are not themselves challenged, that all that is asked is that those goals are pursued with greater compassion for the lives of individual animals, then compassionate conservation is also conservation. But I've suggested that in more extreme cases where the lives of individual animals are deemed more important than the continued existence of ecological wholes such as species, then these views are not conservation. But the question of whether they're legitimate views is a different one. Thank you very much for your attention.